What is up guys, and welcome back to another Wrath of the Lich King Classic video. So today we are doing something fun, exciting and controversial, and that is ranking the DPS specs in Wrath of the Lich King. And more specifically, we are ranking the DPS specs for patch 3.3.5, aka the patch that we are most likely getting for Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Throughout this video, I will also talk about why most tier lists are actually way inaccurate for Wrath of the Lich King Classic, what you should be on the lookout for when determining a class's worth, and yes, I will also be providing you with what I think is the DPS list for patch 3.3.5 based on experiences on different servers out there, as well as the statistics that we currently have available. Patch 3.3.5 or whatever patch we get for Wrath of the Lich King, but I'm pretty sure it will be through patch 3.3.5, will be the final patch of the OG Wrath patch, where classes have been ironed out to their final versions of the expansion, where all of the major and minor adjustments have been fixed. So for example, a class that would actually be S tier in 3.1 might not actually be S tier in that phase in Classic Wrath, because we now have 3.3.5 class balancing. For example, in patch 3.3.0, Shadow Priests got their damage significantly buffed from their previous class iterations in previous patches. Improved Devouring Plague now deals 10/20/30% of its initial periodic damage or periodic effect instantly, up from 5, 10 and 15%, literally doubling the effect of that talent. Shadow Form now also causes Devouring Plague and Vampiric Touch to benefit from haste, which is an obvious DPS increase, as your damage over time effect will tick faster. Death Knight also had significant buffs in patch 3.2, which will still be active in patch 3.3.5, such as plus 15% increase to damage done by both Blood Plague and Frost Fever. Not only were there class changes throughout Wrath of the Lich King, but they also adjusted how classes react to different stats and their benefit from each individual stat, such as patch 3.1, where all classes now receive 25% more benefit from armor penetration rating, and once again that adjustment will still be active in patch 3.3.5. All of these changes means that any patch 3.0 or 3.1 tier list that you have seen up to now will not be representative of what will happen in phase 1 or phase 2 of Wrath Classic, because it's all based on patch 3.3.5 adjustments. So with that said, let's get into my specific patch 3.3.5 tier list for DPS. One last thing to mention is that this list will be based on having best in slot gear, not progression gear, just to keep it simple. I'm going to go through this class by class to keep it a little bit clean. So first off, mages. Mages can be incredibly strong or they can be very weak. It all depends on which spec you play, and that is why this tier list is here. Each spec has its own strengths and weaknesses, and while Frost might be the go-to spec for leveling up, and even PvP because of Deep Freeze and your Water Elemental, it is definitely not the spec to go for raiding. You are much better off playing any of the other two specs, and Frost gets put into the don't play category. Arcane is one of the specs with pretty okay burst, I guess, but you also go out of mana pretty fast. This means that Arcane mages can actually be close to top DPS for the first 10 seconds of a boss fight, and then it's all downhill from there. In certain speedrunning metas with incredibly short bursts, it might be okay, but on fights such as the Lich King, which is a 15-minute fight, you are going to spend the majority of that fight literally out of mana, and you'll be near the bottom of the damage meters overall. Arcane is C tier, maybe even don't play, but C tier at best. So that brings us to Fire, and Fire mages are incredible. This is because of many different factors such as class tuning, stat optimization, and having that 4-set bonus is absolutely ridiculously overpowered for Fire mages. Fire mages will be the absolute kings of Icecrown Citadel, and if you're playing a mage, you are in for a treat. And while I'm out here talking about classes that can be both good and terribly bad at the same time, depending on which spec you play, Let's talk about hunters. Hunters are fun, they have different class fantasies tied to each individual spec. You can even have spectral beasts as pets by taming some rare pets in Wrath, but no matter how fun Beast Mastery is, and how it looks on paper, the fact is that most of your damage is being dealt by your pet, and your pet don't scale that well with your gear. Relying on a minion to deal your damage for you is not a good idea, and Beast Mastery Hunters should not be played inside raids. Literal don't play category. Throw Survival Hunters in there as well, because once again, while being a melee hunter sounds fun on paper, that is pretty much where the excitement stops. Marksmanship Hunters on the other hand, they scale very well with gear, get better over time as you get more and more gear, well obviously, and obtain better weapons. They scale incredibly well with agility, critical strike, and your actual weapon damage, and they are very strong ranged DPS with lots of sustainable damage, allowing them to perform well on both short and long fights. Marksmanship Hunters are S tier. Next up is Paladin. Paladins only have one DPS spec available, aka Retribution, and Retribution is pretty good in patch 3.3.5. Not much more to say about it. Paladins in general are pretty good in Wrath, and you can't go wrong with choosing a Paladin. Paladins are high S tier. Next up, Shamans. Let's get a bit controversial here, because this class can actually go pretty much anywhere on the list. First though, let's not beat around the bush. If you're going to be a range class to the raid, there's about 753 better options than Elemental Shamans, and Elemental Shamans are put into the literal don't play category. The only reason to bring these guys is if you don't have any other Shamans, and you can't find a Resto Shaman, or an Enhancement Shaman, and you desperately need those totems. Enhancement Shamans on the other hand can be put into any of the tiers from C tier up to S tier, depending on who plays it. The average Enhancement Shaman will probably be stuck at around high C tier to low B tier, but if you're very good at your class you can go all the way up to S tier. To keep it simple, I'm going to put them into B tier. For Death Knights, Frost and Unholy are usually pretty similar in terms of DPS, and the main difference is usually that Frost is the easier spec, while Unholy is a little bit more difficult to master, but once you do master it, you might be able to deal a little bit more DPS than most Frost Death Knights. Regardless, I am putting both specs into high A tier, potentially S tier, especially if you're able to grab Shadowmourne, but I mean, any class that can use Shadowmourne is automatically placed pretty high on that list. So let's talk about Warriors. Warriors is the classic WoW mains that reroll to Warlocks and are now rolling back to Warriors to once again be the kings of the jungle. One major difference from classic WoW to Wrath of the Lich King is that Arms Warrior is not the best spec, and Arms is actually ranked quite low on the DPS meters, all the way down to C tier actually, but probably at the top of the C tier, arguably creeping up towards B tier. Fury on the other hand climbs all the way up to the top, way up to the OP tier, rivaling Fire Mages on the damage meters, performing like actual beasts. Go hard or go home, it is time to top the damage meters. I don't think there's any interesting views on why Fury is better than Arms in patch 3.3.5, it just boils down to the fact that Fury scales better with the gear, and abilities such as Bloodthirst scales with its attack power, which makes Fury react better to stats such as strength and armor penetration, and wielding two two-handed weapons through Titan's Grip also gives you more stats to scale off of. Also, just to speed things up, I am throwing both Feral Druids, I am throwing both Feral Druids into S tier and Boomkins into A tier, simply because of how they scale with the gear, and Boomkins gets a lot of small quality of life upgrades throughout the patches of Wrath, which allows them to sustain very high damage while not going out of mana, making them a pretty good class overall. Next up, let's go through Warlocks. Destruction Warlocks are not really played that much on Wrath servers in the latest patches, and for good reason. They don't perform too well on the damage meters, and for that I really wanted to put them into the don't play category, but I am going to put them at the bottom of the C tier list instead. Demonology Warlocks, on the other hand, are a little bit better, weirdly enough, as they also rely on their minions to deal damage, or some of their damage, and we saw how that turned out for Beast Mastery Hunters. But Demonology Warlocks actually have decent DPS, and because of that they are pretty much in the middle of the bunch on this list. Affliction Warlocks are even better, with damage over time effects dealing the majority of your damage. This class is incredibly strong on most fights in patch 3.3.5, and this puts it all the way at the top of the S tier, in my opinion. So now we are getting somewhere. We only have 2 classes left to go, and one of those classes only have 1 DPS spec, so let's talk about the Shadow Priest. Like I talked about earlier in this video, Shadow Priest did get some of their damaging abilities buffed in patch 3.3 or 3.3.0, such as Devouring Plague, and Devouring Plague and Vampiric Touch now also scales with your haste, and because of this, Shadow Priests actually rank right next to the Boomkins in the A tier. That being said, Shadow Priest also brings a lot of hidden utility to the raid, so Shadow Priests are not only good for the damage output, they do a lot of carrying on the back end. Now let's get this done and talk about the final class, Rogues. First of all, let's get the bad spec out of the way and throw sub-rogues into the don't play category. Sub-rogues are great for PvP, but horrible for PvE, and to deal even a fraction of the damage of a combat or assassination rogue, you have to be beyond an expert at the spec, so it's harder to play and you deal less damage, so literally just don't play it. Assassination, on the other hand, is quite good, but not the best, but also not the worst, pretty much right in the middle, and I've chosen to put this into A tier, but at the top of the A tier, so this spec could fit into both the A tier and the S tier in my opinion, based on who plays it. That being said though, if you pulled most rogues based on average skill levels, I think the average as a rogue will be A tier, which is why I put it there. That leaves us with 1 spec remaining, and that is Combat Rogues, which are at the top of the food chain in the OP tier, right next to Fury Warriors and Fire Mages. Combat is absolutely amazing, especially if you're able to cooperate with a Death Knight into giving you Hysteria, and coordinate that with your own cooldowns. It is so much fun, and you're dealing a metric ton of DPS, a seriously fun class indeed. So yeah, there you go, that is my final tier list for patch 3.3.5, and now that I've got you to watch the entire video, keep in mind that this is with best in slot gear from Icecrown Citadel, including tier 4 set bonus from ICC, so this is not going to be what the DPS meters for phase 1 of Wrath Classic will look like, but it might be what the DPS meters for the final phase of Wrath Classic looks like. I will make an in-depth tier list for phase 1 of Wrath Classic once we have some more information available, as that will depend on which patch we are actually on, item optimization, class balancing, item balancing, and stat balancing, such as how we react to armor penetration, and stat scaling as well, and we need to think about patch 3.3.5 optimization, but with Naxxramas gear instead of ICC gear. Either way, that video will be out sooner or later as well. I will leave a link to the tier list maker in the video description, so feel free to make your own tier list, and then join my Discord server once again through the link in the description, and show me what your tier list looks like. Once again, I want to say that this video and tier list is based on patch 3.3.5, and will not be realistic for phase 1 of Wrath Classic, as a tier list for phase 1 will have to be made with patch 3.3.5 in mind, but with Naxxramas gear and itemization. Also, some of the classes brings with them a lot of buffs to other people in the raid, which puts them even further up in the list, so whenever you are thinking about which class you are bringing to a raid, it is not all about top DPS, it's also about class synergy and utilizing their buffs. For example, you want at least 1 Feral Druid for the leader of the pack buff. And if you enjoyed the video and want to see more Wrath content, slap that like button and make sure you are subscribed. That is pretty much it, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon.